many others. However, when it comes to Sami people with indigenous, with impairments, we find in our research that they actually lacking equality in several areas. For example, when it comes to education, health, work, democratic participation, and such things. So even if things might be better than other places, it's not all right. So what we do find is that Sami people with disabilities experience exclusion and discrimination both because they have an impairment and because they are Sami. Just like intersectionality, as Sif was speaking about. So, for example, many Sami with impairments experience bullying and hate speech both because of their Saminess and because of their impairment. Moreover, what is also important to be aware of is that Sami people with disabilities experience exclusion and discrimination both inside the Norwegian communities and the Sami communities. And that also is very important to address. We will now present examples of some exclusion and discriminating barriers. What we find is that there are many structural barriers in the Norwegian society when it comes to, for example, how welfare services offer standardized services tailored to the needs of the majority, just like you were speaking about stereotype there. So this means that everybody is treated just the same regardless of their cultural background, and that Sami people with impairments thus meet services that exclusively focus at their impairment and ignores their Sami background. So even though the situation is reported to get better, we do find that due to lack of cultural competence and culturally sensitive practice in the welfare services, Sami people with disabilities still experience cultural and linguistic barriers. And that services are not adapted to their needs. To illustrate such language and cultural barriers, I will present an example. Let's start with Pierre. He is a young Sami, born with a hearing loss, and describes how he, professional, when he was little, persuaded his parents to let him learn Norwegian rather than Sami, arguing that being bilingual was not possible for people with his kind of impairment. Thus, he never learned Sami. This decision has had a major impact on his whole life. According to him, not speaking Sami has limited contact both with his own family and excluded him from gatherings with friends, political committees, organization work, etc. In this way, blocking his access to his own culture. And this is not an exclusive example. We meet this in different ways. So an important measure to gain equality is thus to increase the competence on Sami culture and language in the welfare services. However, even though cultural competence is very important to offer culturally sensitive services, it at the same time is important to avoid stereotypes. How Sami people with disabilities relate to the Sami background and Sami culture varies greatly, depending on conditions such as age, type of impairment, geography, gender, etc. So here illustrated with pictures of how some young Sami choose to present themselves. So providing adequate services implies, just like you said here earlier, providing quite different welfare services adjusted to each individual. For example, young city Sami might prefer services provided quite different from an elderly Sami fisherman who has experienced the assimilation process. So to barriers within the Sami community. A challenging barrier which is important to address in the Sami community is the perception of what is real Sami. Traditional criteria of Saminess have been being able to speak the Sami language, having reindeer, etc. We find that the lack of connection to Sami culture and language for people with disabilities may lead to that both the disabled people themselves and other Samis questions whether they are actually entitled to define themselves as Sami. So the criteria of what is considered Sami is very important to look into to make a sort of more diverse and including perception that makes also Sami people with disabilities able to define themselves.
Yeah. Manner. What does it mean to evaluate and emphasize a culture specific in an indigenous way of thinking due to values, history, and everyday life? I will start with the cosmology of the Sami. And here you see the stone case. 10,000 years ago, you can read, and looking at the stone, you see the overworld, you see the material world, and you see the underworld at the stone. And this is tell us about the connection to land and nature. And it's very important that to say it's a long-term connectedness, and you can't just cut it down, this connectedness. And you also find traces in themselves. You ask the tree if you have permission to cut it onto woodcuts, because you speak with the nature, and you ask for allowance. And also the spirituality is connected to nature and land. And in Arctic region, in North, also Sweden, Norway, and Finland, you also see Laestadianism. It's a revival movement. It had happened a transmission with the Sami old religion called shamanism, or in the Norwegian, the Sami language, Nuaide tradition. And this is an example with Eparash down there. Is infants were put outside to die, especially handicapped children. And you can hear them even today screaming in the wood, in places where they were put them, even today. And I've also heard that when I'm walking in the woods. This Laestadian and the next one. You see the picture here, how they managed to colonize the Sami. You see the Sami preacher there, and you see the Norwegian preacher and the translator in between. And this is how it happened to change, to transmit the Norwegian culture into the Sami heads and bodies. So equality in a sustainable manner. I won't read everything there, but past experience are linked to Sami collective consciousness and form part of the present Sami self-understanding even today. And we also see them when they act as a disability. And during the colonization, the Sami had to change their Sami names. And today, many persons with disability have Norwegian names, and outside in the North Norway, we can't find them because they have Norwegian names, only if they have Sami names. You can also see when they're testing them for Asperger, autism, and other disabilities, the testing are not fits for the Sami disabilities. And some examples here you can see here for yourself. But they are also talking about racism, and the racism is in the system, not only relational, in relation, but it is structural. So you can change to the last one. And you see here that to regain equality in a sustainable manner, it's depending, as I said, in structural changes. It was said today that they had two cultural changes, but you have also to do in structural. And within both the law and welfare system. And the law is how to cope with the Sami disability are not clear enough. you don't often reach their needs because they don't talk about it. And when you talk to them, they don't talk back and tell about their needs. So we need to recognize and respect the Sami worldview, value system, and cultural norms, as I showed you before, because you have to respect the worldview of them. Political poverty, you found that among them, the disabilities, and also their parents coping with their children, special. And you lack, and today in northern Norway, we lack of educated personnel, make it difficult to defend and argue for Sami needs in a Norwegian majority context. And it's also lack of research. So we Sami people, we hope, we have a future hope that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will present their findings next year, in August next year. And we are the first of the Nordic countries. Sweden and Finland is coming after us. And we hope that the last meeting, when I met them, they said that we want to look at the structural discrimination, for there we can change also the culture. For you remember, also structural is cultural. So you can change the structure too. Yeah, thank you.
Concrete action. Our next speaker, Mr. I'm sorry, I have to put on the microphone, sorry. I start all over. Customizing services means taking concrete action. Our next speaker, Mr. Nils Tutu Bertelsen, will give us practical information on how services are accommodated to indigenous culture in Greenland. Mr. Bertelsen is the principal at Gertrud Rask Minde, an institution for youth with disability in Sisimiut. The presentation will be in Greenlandic, but will be translated in English after the seminar. The floor is yours, Mr. Bertelsen.
No. Qoyarusarpunga аккерсарнеқарсиманииннут имаатто уллуунуарлу ангерларсимаффиммингааниерпунга тасса кертуасминамингаанниит таккуа уллуунуарлу ангерларсимаффиуо таккуна наюоқартуусут тассааппут иннерлуутиллит таавалу имаатто ерсингитсуми иннерлуутиллит таамааллуни тассанниоқартуутигут катиллуи фаамтаниуппут иммиккоорторту марлууппут тассанилу иммиккоортортами иннерлуутиллит мултихантикарни таасартаккагу тассаниппуллу наёқартут арфиниллит иммиккоорторт акуллерми имаат арфини акуллерни тассанниоқарпут имаап qulingilluat тассаниппуллу тимиккут писиннаанерит тассимапу атихорти аутисми таулу сумииннаккат таулу тусилартуутеқарлуталу наатсумик эққалаарпаа уллуунуарлу ангерларсимафикертуасмина я тасса имминулисаритилаассаанга Нилс Берtilsen матерарпунга уллуиннартууту форстаанериунга персаасуунга амма 2020 миллисулилерпунга кертуасмин сиксофониллу киоқарлуга тасса ернеқарпунга симмани укиулик таулу сунгиффими соқутисакка укууппут тасса тимерсорнеқ пиниарнеқ қимуссарнерлу пингортитар пиниарнеқ тасса уллунуарлу ангерларсимаффимми аторторуйссуарпут тассани культуурпу пингаартиккатсигу аама наёқартуутит тасиуниссами атаавартумик ингерлаттуааннарниссаат ангорусуттарлутигу сиуллермаами қалаассуаа писиннаатилааффига туартуутигут тассами наёқартуутигу туарсиннаатитаанерс сартик тастаана таана саллуунеқартуарпу таамааллута қуанартуми аама туарфик қанимусулеқатигалугу тааматут ингерлаттаратсигу пиниарне укиутамаат нута писсаатитааник нерисақарнеқ пингаартиттуарпу тассанилу укиуккут умимманниарнеқ ааллутнеқартарпо упернассаккуллу ақиссит укаллиллу таамааллу укиунааллугу аама нерисисақартуартарлута аасаанерани аалисаккеринеқ укиассаккуллу ааварнеқ туттунниарнерлу so ангерларсмав тастаариккатут ангерларсмав киатерисмина сапингисамик нута писсаритааник нерисақарнеқ ингерланиартарпо наёқартуутигут иннарлуутилиттагут пингаартиппаат сапингисамик инуссутиссақарлуартумик нерисақарниссаат нангуларпумми таматта иннерлуутилиттагут қану нерисассаат акиуссутиссақарлуартут пингаартит писариақартиннераат уллуиннарни наёқартуутигумми илай туа сангиттуппут таамаллути нукиссақарлуарниссааник нерисаммигут суунаммилим аама тими алатиннэрмигут тааматут писсақартиллугит писсақартинниарлугит ингерлаттарпу суунами ампиниартут аама аторлуарнартарпут нуутта писсаритааник нерисассаник писиффиинеқартарлутик маккуунеруллуппуллу тасса уагут ангусиннаангисагут ааққумнеқай таутикауллуллу маттааллу илаалулангуллу имарми умасут инорнарсиннаасарамик уутсиннут миннерунгтумик иннарлуутилитсиннут таамаамат тассууник иллеқалаарпо таамааллута пингор пинниартортагут аама аторлуарнеқартар укиунеран римуссиник умимманниарнеқ тасса илеққуусутут аамалу культуреерпут аттаккумаллугу укиунеран римуссиник умимманниарнеқ инуустуаққат пеқатигалугит пиниалуттарпугут пингаарутеқарпорми инуусуттагут миннерунгитсумик тимиккут писиннаанерит культури минник илинниартитиниссаанник пингаартиттарпарпут тааккуммамити сиуниссагут аммалу тими алатиннissaa аам пингаарутеқарпу тааккунунга пиниарнернеқ аама аллунеқарнаажорпо аасаанерани периарфисса аторнеқарлуартарпо тасса нуна тимаани намматтагалерлун писуттуарне ассерсуутигаллусисимиунни иккаарлуссуармут 160 километрми исоқартутисилмми тассанилу сапаати акуннаранут иммаа аторнекаюттарпо таамааллуни наёқартуутитсиннут аама писсарсиффиуллуартарлуни силами анерне тимерсорнерлу тасса аама аторлуарнеқартарпо тимерсоқатигинни иннерлуутилиттагут пеқатаатиннеқартарпут таамааллутик аама иннуттаасунут акуутиннеқарниссаминнут периарфиссиннеқартарлутик аамалу тикиллуаққусаасарлутик ассерсуутигу км лангаанимик иннерлуутиллит иммиккут ааққиссууссамик аама пеқатаатиннеқартармата таманна ассоққуямасуутига наххатаатиуллеқуярусуппунга аккерсарнеқарсиманиннут FN адаатимититалиарсуанут тас укиутамаастаан писартоқ таамааллута аама кертруасминами пингортита нунатталу писсаратитааник оқалтуалаарниссанник ангусси лаарниссанниллу периарфиссиннеқарпунга қуямасуутигалугу саққаммиуппарпут нуарсармиоқатитсиннут қуяна
Thank you, Mr. Bertelsen. And as I said, your presentation will be translated into English after the seminar. Both the mental and physical health of indigenous persons can be affected by environmental degradation, toxic waste, and forced migration, among other challenges. I give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Mrs. HAYLI.AM, who will talk about the equal right to good mental health for indigenous persons and the significance of adherence to nature and land. Mr. Eko-Hawk is Master of Science in Organizational Behavior and has more than 30 years of experience working with tribal behavioral health. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all. My name is HAYLI.AM. I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and I first want to thank the government of Norway and the Nordic Council of Ministry for inviting me today. I bring you greetings from my tribe to your indigenous people. I have some experiences of indigenous mental health that I want to share with you, but first I want to just give you a quick glance at tribes in the United States. My tribe, the Pawnee Nation, is one of 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. The U.S. government recognizes those tribes as sovereign nations. So we are sovereign nations within a nation of the United States. There are also state-recognized tribes, which are not federally recognized. They're not recognized as sovereign nations, but of course we all know that they are in spirit. Nearly half of all the 574 tribal nations in the U.S. are in Alaska. And over 70% of all Native people in the United States live in urban areas or and they refer to themselves as urban Indians. This is just a quick history of the colonization of native land in the United States. So look at the top, the red at the top. The far left is probably 1700s. The red is all native lands. As it progresses, colonization progresses across the top with the red. You see the land, native land in red, smaller, being diminished. The big map is today native lands that are left. So environmental degradation occurred all across these centuries across our native civil societies. So as a reminder, since we are so fortunate to be in New York City also was indigenous land at one point. The Lenape tribe, the Mannahatta tribe, which is where Manhattan got its name. So those are the tribes, you're on tribal land now. And just as a reminder, this is courtesy of the New York Indian Council, and they superimpose native tribes onto the outside on the street. So when you walk around, you'll see, think about the native land that you're walking on. So now let's talk about mental health. I was very happy to see with the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights in 2007 that one of the articles addressed the equal right of indigenous people to have the highest standard of physical and mental health. And that's just an excerpt of the article. But things get very complicated after this. Back to policy issues. Next slide. So there, in the United States, as in most countries, there are services available for people that are in emotional distress or who have suffered from trauma. But the question is, are those supports designed for Native people? The answer is no. I like to use the term, instead of disabilities, I prefer to use the term differently able. Native people who have gone through, experienced trauma and generations of trauma and social injustice, not unlike our other indigenous people around the world, they are differently able. And they are survivors. Worldview, as you all mentioned, has a tremendous impact on Indigenous mental health, and I want to show you some examples of that. But before I do that, let me just tell you my personal belief, which I believe is true everywhere I have traveled across the United States and in other countries. Indigenous people are brilliant, period. They're brilliant. They're born brilliant. It's in our DNA. However, generational trauma and trauma history has impacted normal health, interrupted normal, healthy family functioning. Colonization has interrupted normal life. Racism and discrimination perpetuates ongoing trauma and social injustice, and for some people, not all, but for some, that creates self-doubt and emotional imbalance. So how and why does worldview in mental health matter? Why does it matter? It matters a lot. So on the left is a Western worldview, which is a belief in superiority. Man on top, woman below, animals, two-legged, fish, plants, everything is below. Superiority, man on top. That's a general Western perspective. On the right is the graphic of an Indigenous worldview, which is based in relationship. There is no person on top. An animal is as important as a human. Plants are as important as humans. So you can see the difference in worldview. I wanted to mention Reinhold Niebuhr because he was an American theologian and a social commentator. He actually was the original author of what's now called the Serenity Prayer that's used in Alcoholics Anonymous across the world. But he also became a colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King. So one of the things Niebuhr did is that he examined in his work those who hold power. And those that hold power have an assumption of moral and intellectual superiority over others, meaning often Indigenous people. So his work influenced Dr. Martin Luther King because Dr. King had an early belief that he believed in the goodness of man. And he believed that the natural goodness of man and the natural power of human reason would equal social justice. But Dr. Niebuhr realized that's not true. And so when Dr. Martin Luther King studied Niebuhr, it made him rethink his assumption that society change for the good would happen naturally because people have a natural, Dr. King believed that people have natural goodness and they would see their wrong and it would change. Niebuhr helped Dr. King rethink that. And Dr. King still believed in the goodness of man, but that alone was not going to make social change. So the other reason it matters on mental health and emotional wellness, the worldview perspectives, is Western worldview shapes Western science. Western science influences training. Training results in credentials, in this situation, mental health credentials. Credentials are needed for billable services, and billable services are the funding, it's the money that supports mental health services. So in that cycle, what's wrong with that cycle is it perpetuates a Western worldview. So how does this cycle address the indigenous cultural self? And again, the answer is it does not. So indigenous people who are seeking ways to recover from trauma or grief or any loss of land that creates an emotional imbalance, going to a Western mental health alone doesn't work. There has been some change in recognition by United States mental health institutions very recently. In October 2021, a few months ago, the American Psychological Association put out a formal apology to people of color that they realize that they failed in their role in the discipline of psychology and were complicit in contributing to systemic inequalities, and they hurt many people through racism, discrimination, and degradation of people of color within the American Psychological Association. They also did a chronology. It's something to look up if you are interested. Look up the APA apology, and they also did a chronology of the hundreds of years of their crimes against, moral crimes against people of color. So solutions, what has happened that is very good. Indigenous people in the United States have developed many, many ways to address and support mental and emotional wellness. And I'm going to give you one example of each of these: culture, nature, land, and litigation. So the next, Indigenous Alaska, they have every other year a gathering they call Celebration. And it's a gathering of the indigenous people in Southeast Alaska. This just happened earlier this month. They celebrate 10,000 years of cultural survival. Some people speak of historical trauma. I prefer to see it as historical resilience. So indigenous mental health here in the United States, and really in other places, our friends and relatives in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, everywhere indigenous people are in the world. Indigenous mental health acknowledges trauma, but it builds on cultural strengths. Native-centric services are being developed and have been developed everywhere, which means that Native culture and Native beliefs and Native strengths, indigenous strengths, are the center. They're not an afterthought. It's not Western mental health services and then maybe later culture. No, it's culture, Native-centric. And then the conventional Western mental health supports might be secondary. Language is important. The way people talk, how they talk, the pace of their conversation, who they talk to based on protocol of the indigenous nation, all of that is sacred and sacred. So we talk about sacred trust. Assessment, diagnosis, and treatment are looked at in terms of sacred trust, that the provider, the mental health clinician, has a sacred responsibility to respect that Native person. And what an honor it is for them to sit across from a Native person and to let that Native person tell their story. What an honor to them. There's many examples of this, and there's some work going on with integration of traditional practices with Western substance use treatment and mental health, and I gave you a link that you can look at later. Culture is medicine. One of the tools that was developed in Canada that is really being used across different places in the U.S. is the cultural connectedness scale. It's a tool that many people and communities are using to, as a first step in clinical assessment, is they have a cultural connectedness scale that was developed by Angela Snowshoe in Canada. So if you look up cultural connectedness scale, it'll pull up. It's been modified for the US, and it's very helpful because it starts with strengths. Mental health services are deficit-based. The Western perspective is a medical model deficit. So unless you create ways to look at strengths first, it won't happen in Western. So lots of great work going on across the country in cultural medicine. And nature is the foundation. That many tribes in the U.S. have moved from food deserts to food sovereignty. There's a resurgence of their native food cultivation. There's seed preservation projects. There's many intergenerational efforts where elders are teaching younger people about native foods, and there's also efforts of describing, applying clinical definitions to native food gathering. So it's not just substances. It is. It could be grief therapy. It could be a process. You can put a clinical definition to most of the food gathering efforts. The other power that the tribes in the United States have as nations is the power of litigation. And back to the example I gave you about Martin Luther King, the goodness of people's heart is not always going to make social change. So tribes have used the power of their attorneys and their sovereign nation status to force the United States to take measures to adhere to treaties and to protect them and to support their native indigenous beliefs. One example is when the opioid crisis hit the United States, which was primarily in the United States, not anywhere else in the world. Many of the big pharmaceutical companies oversupplied tribal areas with opiates and led to huge addiction. Some of the tribes sued the big pharmaceutical companies, and they won. They won $590 million recently. That money is going to tribes all across the country to support mental health and substance use treatment services. So they really know how to use the power of litigation. So I want to leave you with two resources, indigenous resources for your communities. One is the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights. There's this wonderful book that was developed called Lifting Hearts Off the Ground. So what they do is they take each one of the articles, and the United Nations articles are not poetry. They are legal language, very dry, but they interpret each article. Lila June Johnson is a Native woman. The other woman, Joy DeVito, is referred to as a settler, non-Native. But they each write a short poem that interprets each article. It's a beautiful book. So I'll share that resource with you. And the last resource I want to share with you is something that we developed this year, 2022. We call it Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance. It's a monthly series. It's in English. It occurs the fourth Tuesday of every month for 1 hour. And I leave you with the link. But it has been incredibly popular. We have 300 to 400 people every month that register. We recruit the best minds in the country, Indigenous, to talk about a range of mental health and substance use topics, and it's incredibly popular. And I do that with USET, which is the United South and Eastern Tribes, and their communication staff developed that logo on the right, which I think is brilliant in itself, of the head with the stars, the morning stars of brilliance in in his head. So that's a very popular, and you can see the recordings, the past recordings as well. But I thank you again for inviting me. And then the last slide is just contact information if you'd like any more information about any of these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, HAYLI.AM. Thank you. Our next and last speaker is Mr. Janne Hirvosvapio, a member of the Social and Health Committee in the Sami Parliament in Finland. Mr. Hirvosvapio will focus on multiple discrimination, intersectionality, and the effects of climate change to Sami people. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank for all the powerful speeches we've heard here today. I will discuss Indigenous persons with disabilities and multiple discrimination that they're exposed to, including people with dementia. I will also very briefly touch on the topic of the environment from Indigenous context. I would like to emphasize that I speak from the perspective of a non-disabled Sami person, and my background is within the Finnish side of the Sami community. I would like to thank our Norwegian and Nordic colleagues for the hard work to make this event happen. It is a great pleasure to be here today with you and change ideas and views on this extremely important topic. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons state that Indigenous persons have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive political, legal, and economic, social, and cultural life and institutions. As such, when discussing Indigenous peoples, we have to consider that the environment and nature still has a central meaning to Sami people's life, with our 8 seasons that are based on, for example, reindeer herding practices. Excuse me. It should be taken into account that language, culture, and traditional livelihoods are often viewed inseparable from one another, and they are all connected to the use of land and traditional knowledge. If one of these parts fail, the whole structure is in danger of collapse. This has a lot to do with the complex settler colonial history and assimilation policies of the Nordic states in the context of Sami people, but now also the effects of climate change have become ever apparent. We are facing degradation of pastures, invasive species moving further on our traditional lands, but we are also dealing with the threat of increasing mining activities, deforestation, and plans for large wind farm plantations. To understand the rights of disabled peoples in the Sami context, we must also consider their right to participate in traditional tasks and the ability to take part in our society, just as was mentioned in earlier presentations. But when discussing persons with disabilities or on discrimination faced by them, people often stay at a very general level. Indigenous people or people belonging to minorities are not specifically or particularly taken into consideration, and multiple discrimination that they're exposed to is not recognized at different levels in the Nordic societies. When it comes to the rights of Indigenous persons with disabilities, the topic is often approached from a very one-sided perspective. Intersectional approach to rights of Indigenous persons with disabilities is still at the margins in our societies. Thus, I truly hope that by providing these platforms, like here today, for discussion, we can change that situation. For us, Sami, our people, despite living with or without disabilities, are important and valuable members of our society. As Indigenous persons, Sami with disabilities also have the right to their own languages and their own culture throughout their whole life cycle. This should, of course, be self-evident, but when it comes to minorities and societies, majority groups view them too often as one homogeneous group. The needs of those people representing minorities within minorities are not recognized well enough. We hope that this will change in the future and different backgrounds of people will be considered while making decisions, finding solutions, or developing new technologies and assisting devices to help people in their everyday lives. I want to emphasize the status and the meaning of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as one of the most important documents which offer guidance for building equal societies in which the rights of indigenous peoples are fully implemented. This is because indigeneity gets only a passing mention on the UN Disability Treaty, and it's not directly factored into the body of the treaty. It should also be mentioned that implementation of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has not been a success story everywhere, and not in Finland either. We often see lack of political will to start to develop and implement national action plans to achieve the goals of the Declaration. For example, in Finland, there is no adequate data available regarding the measures taken to implement the articles of the Declaration to the national legislation, not to speak of the concrete results or changes achieved through these measures. Even though it should be self-evident in the world that we're living today, I still want to repeat one very important message of the Declaration. Indigenous individuals are entitled, without discrimination, to all human rights recognized in international law. The outcome document concentrates precisely on promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous persons with disabilities, and it urges states to continue improving their social and economic conditions, including by developing targeted measures for the aforementioned action plans, strategies, or measures in collaboration with indigenous persons with disabilities themselves. This is something that we consider essential when developing national action plans. There is no one else who could speak better about action or measures than Sami persons with disabilities themselves. To be able to meet the challenges and ensure the well-being of Sami persons with disabilities, we also need more information on the situation. We need more concrete data on services that are already available and what still need to be developed. We need data on the possibilities to use Sami languages, these persons' mother tongue, in social and healthcare service, and we need more data on discrimination that Sami persons with disabilities are exposed to in the Nordic societies. The situation between Sami communities across borders vary in terms of services. Unfortunately, in Finland, healthcare services in North Sami either do not exist or they are severely lacking. The lack of services is even more apparent in the smaller minority Sami languages in Finland, Skolt and Inari Sami languages. And if you have difficulties with cognitive function, speech or other functions, it is one of the utmost importance to get services in your own mother tongue. In health and social services, your cultural background should also be respected and understood because of the complex settler colonial history and assimilation policies in the Nordic states that has caused cross-generational trauma and mistrust between the states and Sami individuals. Cultural sensitivity and language are important for an individual for correct assessment of their needs for services, right diagnosis, rehabilitation, and care. One concrete example are memory tests that are not always available in Sami languages. And this is important because of the right of self-determination, which is one of the central principles of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As mentioned previously, surveys often view Sami as one of the homogeneous indigenous people or persons with disabilities as one minority group, but reality, as we all know, is not that simple. These questions need to be approached through intersectional lenses to achieve more comprehensive understanding of the situation of the Sami persons with disabilities. To be fair, recently development has happened. A few publications have been published on this topic. Important signs have been heard here today as well. But the lack of existing data is pointed out also in those research reports. This would be something concrete to bring forward in the future, and these kinds of actions, we need more resources, more Sami scholars, and guidelines for ethical research in terms of healthcare services. I'm also very happy that the Truth and Reconciliation process in Finland has implemented a psychosocial support unit that offers assistance for individuals during this process. Last, nation states must learn from past mistakes. Doing otherwise would only be a continuation of colonial policies. This event here today will surely add to this discussion and understanding on this topic and bring new ideas on the table. I hope that through cross-border and international cooperation, we will be able to formulate concrete ideas that will turn into concrete actions in order to improve the situation of Indigenous persons with disabilities everywhere. Kiitos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janne Hirvo Svopio, for your speech. Now we have come to an end for this side event on the rights of Indigenous persons with disability. I want to thank you all for your valuable contribution, enlightening us on this important, often neglected topic. I hope today's discussion will be an inspiration for future state reports and national work to implement the CRPD. Thank you all.
Yes, and then
because also have to prep a little for the
event.
For the event and sort of message to the whole country.
I'm sorry, I hadn't registered.
Did it right now?
For me,